Brandon Sanderson's 3 laws of magic are a well-known concept among fantasy writers. While there are many approaches to writing and world-building, having a framework to go off can be a great boon, and the clear direction provided by the 3 laws in conjunction with the idea of hard versus soft magic makes for a very good framework. The first law, an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic, is very straightforward. It's simply the storytelling concepts of stakes, setup, and payoff applied to magic. If you pull new magical abilities out of nowhere, it feels like a deus ex machina. To avoid that, magic either can't solve plot points, or the reader has to have a chance of seeing it coming, which means they have to understand the magic enough to predict what it can do. The third law likewise is fairly straightforward. The author should expand on what is already there before adding something new. This one is simply fairly good advice in general to avoid bloat in world-building. You want what's already there to be fleshed out and interconnected, instead of throwing endless new layers on top. The second law, however, is a little more complicated to apply. Limitations are more interesting than powers. On the face of it, this is as straightforward as the other two. Stories are driven by conflict. An author puts obstacles in the way of their characters, and the characters must attempt to overcome them. So if you want characters to struggle with something, there has to be a limit to what they can do. An omnipotent character isn't going to face a lot of conflict. They have the tools to easily solve their problems. In Sanderson's essay on the second law, he uses Superman and his own Mistborn series as examples. Superman is incredibly powerful. Vast physical strength, laser vision, and flight are just the basics of his powers. But among superheroes, these aren't particularly rare powers. Superman is far from the only one to have this specific combination. What makes Superman who he is his limitations. He has weaknesses to kryptonite and an extremely strong code of ethics. This limits what he can do and creates tension in the story when villains try to exploit his weaknesses. Likewise in Mistborn, Allomancers can use a form of telekinesis. Telekinesis is again a common power. But Allomancers are limited to only affecting metal, only in a direct line to or from themselves, and if they push something heavier than themselves, they will be repelled instead. These limitations make Allomancer unique, and the Mistborn magic system far more interesting than something more generic. The second law, like the first and third, draws on storytelling principles and applies them to magic. The difficulty comes in how to put it into practice. Expanding what's already there and not pulling new powers out of thin air are pretty easy to do, but limitations are more complex. Deciding what magic can't do is as open-ended as deciding what to put into a world in the first place. Depending on the tone of the story and how central of a role magic plays, deciding the extent and type of limitations to use can be critical to the plot. Magic is often very versatile. Unlike most real-world tools, which are best defined by the few things they are useful for, magic is more easily defined by ruling out what it can't do, or by setting clear limits to how good it is at any given thing. To this end, limits in the second law of magic are further split up into limitations, weaknesses, and costs. Costs play a big role in keeping magic systems grounded and stopping them from consuming all other parts of the story. The core issue many magic systems struggle with is that our understanding of the world is that to get something, a certain amount of effort has to go into it. A house can't be built without builders putting in the work. If you want to get strong, you have to exercise. For there to be food, it has to be grown. Magic upsets all of that by pulling results out of thin air. It's like cheating in a game. The characters can simply give themselves extra resources and trivialize the whole thing. A cost prevents this, a downside or trade for power, so it's not free. Downsides and trades are slightly different from each other. Many magic systems require the caster to expend energy, whether that's mana that they can run out of or stamina as if they were physically exerting themselves. That turns the results of magic into a reward for hard work. In the same way a weightlifter using their full strength should be able to lift far more than most people, an archmage using their whole mana pool will of course cast powerful spells. It feels natural from the audience's point of view and puts a cap on how much one character can influence events. They still get to be strong, but only in the same way a master swordsman in another story would be. not like a god handing out miracles. This approach is very useful in a hard magic setting. When the impact magic has on a world and society is a big concern in world building, adding a resource cost to it solves most of the problems. Yes, a wizard can cast a spell that does the work of 10 men, but if they then have to wait a week to refill their mana pool, you're better off just putting those 10 men to work. It's the other side of the argument that magic justifies medieval stasis in fantasy. Some people have put forward the idea that having magic around to do things would stunt technological growth, since you never have to develop technologies to solve problems magic already solves. Following that logic, if magic doesn't solve a problem as well as technology does, then naturally technology would be preferred. A real-life comparison is the Heliopal. This was a simple machine that essentially worked as a small steam engine and was built in the 1st century, and yet it took almost 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. While metallurgy and other technologies at the time weren't sufficient for a real steam engine, they wouldn't have known that. Yet no record seems to suggest any serious attempt to further the technology at the time. And why would they? In the 1st century, the Roman Empire spanned the breadth of the Mediterranean and had no shortage of cheap labor. Much like a fantasy lord with no interest in hiring a wizard to do what regular laborers can, the Romans didn't need great machines to do the work of men. In this way, resource costs bring magic somewhat back in line with the mundane. It becomes more of a useful energy like electricity, powerful and versatile, but with conditions to its use. The more magical side of costs is in downsides and drawbacks. Magic that corrupts, misfires, or comes with unintended side effects. If a resource cost has to be paid up front, a drawback is like a loan. You can cast the spell, nothing is stopping you, but will you be able to deal with the consequences? The popular method is for magic to be something eldritch or infernal. By using it, a wizard draws on influences the human mind isn't equipped to deal with, resulting in either madness or a descent into evil. Alternatively, the impact is on their surroundings, a sort of magical pollution. If magic is drawn from other beings, using it may open the door for these beings to enter reality. The uncertainty and severity of the cost usually scales with the power of the magic. For example, a healing spell might use the caster's life force as fuel and require their sacrifice to save someone from mortal wounds. A wish can accomplish almost anything, but depending on the genie or monkey's paw granting it, you have no idea how it will choose to interpret your words. Both types of cost can present difficulties and opportunities when choosing what exactly has to be given up, because what is valuable to one person won't be to another. A magic system that requires blood sacrifices in the form of animals is unusable to someone who objects to the slaughter of animals, while being essentially infinite power to someone who will happily battery farm. This can be an excellent choice for creating conflict. Some evil cult trying to sacrifice a person in a ritual is a great plot hook to motivate a hero on a quest to save them. Much like the example of Superman and his code of ethics, the villains taking advantage of things the heroes refuse to do is a quick path to raising the stakes. Where it becomes harder is when the costs are more esoteric or ephemeral. Magic that involves bargaining with another being for power often asks for a price that is valuable to the person paying, not necessarily the being asking. There's no real reason a fairy should care about the memory of someone's first love or a memento of their parents. What matters in the deal is that it's important to the person paying. If that is not the case, and the fairy in question does have particularly strong feelings about memories of first love, anyone who doesn't care about a crush they had in school anymore gets that bit of power for free. Weaknesses are in many ways easier to come up with than costs or limitations, but at the same time harder to be original or interesting with. A weakness isn't simply some area where magic falls short or something it can't do. It's something that reduces or opposes magic. A lot of the time that essentially means kryptonite. From a stone or metal that blocks the flow of mana, to cold iron harming fey creatures, to the undead faltering under the sun. Simply pick one substance that magic doesn't do well with. This isn't a bad trope, but it is a very simple one. There is some room for themes here if the material chosen represents something that thematically opposes magic, but as seen with the dozen-plus types of kryptonite that have been invented since the original, it does struggle in the long run. In a shorter story or against plentiful enemies, it won't matter. If a weakness only has to be used once for the final battle, there's no risk of overuse, and regular mooks that would be defeated with a conventional weapon otherwise can simply be taken down with a magical equivalent. But if a main character or villain get repeatedly taken out of play with the same trick, the audience is likely to start viewing the character as weak or their weaknesses as a cheap trick. In the Vampire Diaries, the regular vampires have all the usual weaknesses. A stake through the heart or exposure to sunlight will kill them. Since they are ostensibly regular people with magical boons, in return for a few weaknesses and a maintenance cost, that works. But when later the original vampires are introduced, they need to be a little tougher. They can still be killed, but only using a white oak stake, of which there are only a few, all well hidden. That way their weakness goes from a glaring vulnerability to a long shot at defeating them, which is far more appropriate for a major antagonist. A notable difference here is that unlike some kryptonite equivalent, being vulnerable to something doesn't take away existing powers. In keeping with the theme of costs, vulnerabilities are often a trade-off. Fantasy creatures immune to non-magical attacks, like some variants of werewolves, are often not only vulnerable but especially weak to silver. To the extent they are poisoned by it, and any wound will likely prove fatal. The greater the benefit, the higher the cost. Other weaknesses for magic are things which, rather than counteracting it, outright act in opposition. In a magic system with several types of magic, it's not unusual to see different ones oppose each other. Light magic versus dark magic, or fire versus water. In a similar vein, magic can act in opposition to technology. While it's often technology that malfunctions in the presence of the supernatural, themes of magic as a part of nature failing in the face of industry also exist. In that case, it's important to think about how much and how quickly. Is the magic user's strength slowly sapped away in a hostile location, or do they quickly grow powerless? They may not actively weaken at all, and instead struggle to regain their strength. Fairies in the Foul Adventure series by Owen Colfer must complete a ritual to restore their magic. The ritual requires an acorn from an ancient oak tree next to a riverbend. No ancient oaks or rivers means no ritual, and a fairy will slowly run out of magic. A lot of these weaknesses come from outside the magic user. Internal weaknesses tend to fall under costs. If using magic causes headaches or spikes of anger, that is a cost to using the powers, even if it incidentally makes the caster vulnerable to manipulation or goading. An internal limit that counts as a weakness might be cooldowns to abilities, leaving the caster vulnerable. If they can only have one power active at a time, focusing their energy into an attack means lowering their defenses. Much like in the game FTL, Faster Than Light, limited resources have to be managed. The energy isn't expended like a cost, but it is temporarily tied up. Again, this is a thin line, and you can argue semantics over whether, for example, Vancier magic, like in Dungeons & Dragons, is a cooldown or a cost when you expend spell slots. The way I look at it is that something that is there but can't be accessed is simply in use, while something that is spent and needs to be recharged has been paid as a cost. The final category of Sanderson's types of limitations is limitations. In the broader sense, once an author decides what magic can do, it is limited to doing only that. An elemental magic system with the 4 classical elements can manipulate only those elements. It might over the course of a story expand, with water also manipulating ice, or combinations like earth and fire making lava. But if someone starts pulling out teleportation or making arcane barriers out of nowhere, some serious questions have to be asked. These basic limitations of magic not being omnipotent answer the implicit question of why everything isn't simply done with magic. Like, for example, bringing back the dead. Resurrection, time travel, and precognition are just a handful of abilities that stories often struggle with. Getting the costs and weaknesses for these right is a delicate balance, and most of the time they're implicitly ruled out by the limits of the magic system. Even in a system where magic isn't shown to have a hard limit, it's generally understood that certain things just can't be done, not without great cost. Broad limitations on what magic covers can come from 2 directions. One approach is to decide very precisely what magic can do to the exclusion of everything else. Allomancy is a good example of this. There is a list of metals an allomancer can use and what their effects are. While this is not the full limit of everything in the world of Mistborn, these abilities do not change. If you can use a certain metal, it does its thing and nothing else. The other option, as stated, is that magic can do anything, with a few implicit or explicit exceptions. The genie's wish is seemingly omnipotent except for rules on no killing, bringing back the dead, or making people fall in love. But these broad limitations aren't really where the application of the second law shines. You need them because without these there isn't a magic system to begin with. Without defining whether a magical physical enhancement makes someone a bit tougher than usual or indestructible, you have nowhere to work from. But the most important parts for a story are the very specific rules, and how they're set up can do a lot for the plot and tone. Practical limitations that can be worked around are the big draw for hard magic systems, and one of the reasons Sanderson's books are so popular. The fact that steel pushing, burning steel to push metals away, is directional, and that the lighter object, either the Allomancer or what they're pushing against, moves, is a limitation that has to be worked around, and makes combat scenes far more interesting as the characters use their wits and the environment to their advantage. Other limits, however, are less practical limitations and more story limitations that serve the plot or themes. Take healing magic, for example. If a magic system has a limit on how much healing a person can receive, or healing potions become less effective the more they're used, then that's a practical limitation that characters have to account for and work around. It's a limitation that will have a constant presence in the plot. If, however, the limit is that healing only works on someone who's willing, that will probably only be relevant during an emotional plot point. It's a limitation that exists not for the world building but for the storytelling. Another example could be teleportation. A teleportation spell can have a limit on the number of people it can take, meaning that if the heroes end up with more people than expected, they won't be able to bring them all. Compare that to a party of heroes trapped in the underworld, who realize that for them to leave, someone has to choose to stay behind or the spell won't work. The spell will teleport any number of people, minus the one who has to sacrifice themselves. Theoretically, these two scenarios are the same scene. If the first group of heroes is only one person over the limit, they're facing exactly the same choice. But thematically, someone getting left behind because the plan didn't work out is very different from a heroic sacrifice. The first is a world-building limit to the magic, while the second is a storytelling limit. The three types of limit, weaknesses, limitations, and costs, each perform a slightly different role in getting a magic system to have the intended impact on a world and story. Weaknesses are a way to overcome powerful opponents and keep main characters on their toes. Limitations define the reach of magic and what kind of power or tool it is. Costs stop the useful abilities from getting out of hand and add consequences to careless actions. Getting the right type and balance of these will define magic's tone. When deciding how far to go and what to add or take away from a magic system, it's important to consider the intended outcome. When aiming for a magic system with a fairly low impact on a light-hearted story, it's probably better to turn up the weaknesses and limits rather than the costs. Give characters a few cantrips and low-level spells that add a little flair to the world. A low-power magic system that still has high costs might be more at home in a grimdark setting, where even casting a simple curse at someone comes with worse consequences for the caster. Worth mentioning here is that high costs and strong limits don't have to mean that a magic is weak. Sorcery in Jujutsu Kaisen is all about limitations. Sorcerers' abilities often come with some limits built in. On top of that, they can take binding vows to restrict themselves in some way in return for more power elsewhere. One ability they all share in common is that revealing the nature of your technique, thereby giving yourself a weakness by warning your opponent, grants greater strength to the technique. The entire system is built on limitations, costs, and trade-offs, but by no means does that mean that its users are weak. Balancing the limits is comparable to designing a Magic the Gathering card. In the card game, a simple sorcery will have a mana cost and an effect. The effect is the limitation. The card does its thing and nothing else. The mana cost is obviously the cost. The fact that its target may have immunities or countermeasures is a weakness. To achieve the right power level and tone for their magic system, an author must adjust all three factors. Some magic cards are deliberately more powerful than others, while some are deliberately weaker. Some are even intentionally borderline unusable, with the specific intent of sparking the player's imagination and interest as they try to figure out what to do with them. In the same way, a magic system doesn't need to be balanced like a competitive game, where everything is fair for all players. It should be interesting and serve the needs of its story. Whether that need is for a mysterious distant power, something loud and bright that takes center stage, or something whimsical with a different trick up its sleeve for every occasion. Limits are more interesting than powers, but despite that, a magic system is still built out of what it can do. The negative space of its limitations serves a purpose, but it's in using both of them that magic shines. In a game like Factorio, the player is constantly working towards being able to do more. The game puts a tech tree in front of the player and encourages them to work through it so they can unlock more abilities. But the majority of the time actually playing isn't spent unlocking new things. It's spent using what you have to the best of your ability, figuring out how to make all the components and all their restrictions fit together to achieve something more. That's where the actual gameplay is. A magic system is about the things it can do, but using magic is about the things it can't.